Yeah. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Wisdom Distillery. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Shaman John. Today, we have a lovely, lovely guest for you. His name is Mike Clawson. He's a PhD, Austin-based organizer, teacher, dad, religious scholar, an all-around good guy with a lot of interesting ideas and thoughts and agendas for the world. Good things, all good things. He facilitates spiritual practice salons here in Austin. He's got a thing called Theology Pub and a fun little deal that they do a couple of times a month, I think, called Beer and Hymns, where they sing the old-time hymns, you know, and I like the way he puts it is you can come and do it as literally or ironically as you feel inclined. So yeah, drink beer, sing hymns, sing the old-time hymns of the glory, hallelujah. Anyway, this is a really good one. I really enjoy these kind of conversations. This is the kind of thing that actually got me going on the idea of doing podcasts in general, is to have these kind of conversations that really stimulate what I would consider the more important questions of life. So check it out. I hope you dig it. I think you will. Shh. Hey guys, welcome to another podcast. I'm your host, Shaman John, and today we have a special guest named Mike Clawson, and he's here from the Spiritual Transformation Project. I found out about this gentleman from an event that he had facilitated. Sort of describe that event. What was the gist of that event?
Well, we called it a spiritual practice salon, and it was basically a backyard party where you could mingle and have music and food and drink, and then a practitioner, an expert, would come and share a practice, a spiritual practice that at that particular night was music improv, and how music improv can be a way of practicing vulnerability and connection with the people around you.
Yeah, that was what the appeal was using music as a way in like that for me. That was beautiful. I actually used to do Keychak, monkey chant, and gamelan music, and that was the first experience I really understood. I mean, I'd been in bands in my whole life, you know, so you understand the dynamics of bands, but that's like whatever, 5 guys in a room or 3 guys in a room. But like, there was something about the monkey chant thing, which I would really like to bring into the community because it's basic, so anybody can do it. You can really teach people how to do it, and people really get the sense of everybody moving in this very primal, communal kind of dynamic with a certain section of them chanting this pattern, a certain section chanting this pattern, and then that interweaving, and then them watching each other and listening to each other, and really getting that crazy synergy that can happen in that dynamic, even on a basic level, gets people thinking about like, we are connecting here in a really profound way.
Well, you know, that was the fun thing about this particular event is the guy that facilitated it, a guy named Travis Fitzgold from the Zen Learning Project. Yeah. He primarily works with children using Zen principles for music education. And so a lot of the exercises he led us through that night were stuff that you would do with kids. Yeah. Fun, silly, just playful. Which was playful, and that was the whole point, was that just to let go of the inhibitions, to let go of the things that usually hold us back, and just be weird and just be goofy and just have fun with it.
Did you have any experience with that previously?
Oh no, I'm not really a music person at all, so that was pretty far outside my comfort zone, and it was a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's get into your background a little bit. What I see you went to Baylor University.
Just finished my PhD there, yeah.
Okay, and what was your thesis on?
Well, I was a historical study of religion, so I was in the religion department, but I'm a historian by trade. And my thesis, my dissertation was on how religion in general and Christianity in particular has been evolving over the last 50, 60 years as we enter into this postmodern culture of the 21st century. Just the way it's been shifting, evolving, changing. I don't believe religion and spirituality are ever static things. As much as some groups would like to say, no, this is the one truth we've held for all time, forever and ever, amen. That's just not the case when you look at it historically.
Can't back that up.
Right. So the question that I asked was, okay, well, how is it continuing to evolve? So I'm a historian, but it was very recent history. It's really since the 1960s.
Oh,
yeah.
It is recent. Yeah.
I looked at a particular movement called the Emerging Church Movement, which is kind of a post-evangelical. A lot of conservative Protestants, especially in the United States, in New Zealand, Australia, the UK, a few other places around the globe too. And it was these kind of conservative Protestant Christians that were pushing the boundaries of their faith, theologically, in terms of their communal practices, in terms of kind of their ritual worship practices. Just on all these levels, they were reinventing, reimagining, willing to ask questions and make changes, which is really astounding for conservative religious traditions to be open to that. And so it was this movement that lasted from the mid-90s to about 2010 or so about 20 years.
Mid-90s?
Yeah, 1990s, yeah.
So what drew you to that small little sliver of you know, the broad spectrum of religious history?
Well, on the one hand, that's what you have to do as a PhD. You have to really narrow it down and focus on one thing as a microcosm to understand bigger phenomenon.
Sure.
But I chose that particularly because I was a part of it. That's my own background.
Right.
Because I came out of a conservative Baptist evangelical background and started asking questions and reinventing my faith. And I found this movement, the Emerging Church, and I and I mean, it's not really around as such anymore, but I am still connected in those circles.
Yeah.
And so when I decided to go back for my degree, I thought, let's study what I know and let's analyze this thing that I've been a part of in a more objective sense.
So how has your faith shifted through this process?
Oh, I mean, it's drastically, radically. I mean, from top to bottom. For me, it's been largely an intellectual journey, as you might guess, as an academic. So for me, it's been a lot of my beliefs have shifted, a lot of my theology, so to speak, my understanding of God, of the universe, of what spirituality even is, and its relationship between different religious traditions. I was raised in a faith where the different beliefs were antagonistic and competitive, and they were against each other, and you could either be a Christian or something else, and you couldn't be both. Or even within the Christian tradition, you had to be a Baptist and not a Catholic, or you had to pick a tribe.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with having a tribe and having a tradition that you're rooted in. I still stand in a tradition, but to be open to other points of view and other traditions as not wrong, but just different. That was a major shift for me. One of many, I guess.
And how do you? I think detractors who are dogmatists would say, that would be scripturally incorrect.
Yeah.
that there is only one way, and Jesus said it right here.
There's this Bible scholar named John Dominic Clawson, and he has this great quote where he says, it's not that the writers of the Bible wrote this literal text, and now we only just now, have learned how to take it metaphorically. It's that they wrote it metaphorically, and these days we're stupid enough to try to take it literally.
Right.
And I think he's right. I mean, that's a harsh way to put it, but I really think there was something that happened in the 19th century and the 20th century where Western culture especially got into this very literalistic, scientific, rationalistic mindset where we stopped being able to understand metaphor and myth and symbol as meaningful. We thought we downgraded those somehow to say, oh, that's just a myth. Well, just a myth? Yeah. Myths are powerful, right? As Joseph Campbell would tell us. So, Clawson's point is these things were already powerful as myths and symbol and metaphor. We actually downgraded them when we tried to make them literal history and science and all these other things. So that realization for me, which came by way of fiction, and I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis, Narnia, and all that stuff. Right. Those kind of writers helped me realize that fiction and story and narrative are just as powerful as literal doctrines and absolute beliefs.
Yeah. And when you get into the history of all that stuff, I actually worked with an archaeologist. I guess you could say he's sort of a Jewish Old Testament historian, archaeologist, spent years in Israel and the sacred sites. And, when you break down a lot of the linguistic things that have transpired, the shifts that have transpired, the misunderstanding of the cultural context or the historical context that are being, referencing even places and ideas that what they may throw out or what gets translated into an idea that we think we know what that idea is conveying.
Yeah.
For them, once you factor in the actual translation, the twist that happens in the translation and the time and the place where this thing was taking place, you get an entirely different read on these things.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about people who just take this book, off the shelf that they think is just that showed up that way,
right,
without any context for the total contrivance that went into making that book what it is, and the volumes of content,
hundreds of years of textual history of people writing and editing, and
totally, and stuff that most of us will never even know. I mean, the people who called themselves Christians in the time, who were in their little enclaves, weren't even reading the same book.
Right.
They're all reading disparate little fragments of things, and that becomes their version of Christianity. I've got the book of Jonathan, and it's or the book of Ted, and this little enclave studies the book of Ted, and that's all they've got, and yet they consider themselves Christian because the overarching theme that's within that is somehow speaking to this idea.
I have a friend, a fellow named Brian McLaren, who writes a lot of books and is well known in this emerging church movement. Yeah. And Brian says, what if we stop thinking about the Bible as this constitution?
Right.
This kind of the way people treat the U.S. Constitution sometimes is this is the absolute way it has to be for all time. And said, what if it's more like a community library? This is a community of people, and these are the books that they said were meaningful to them. And you said, different communities had different books. They had different collections in their library. Yeah. And sometimes they overlapped, and sometimes they didn't.
Right.
And it wasn't that these books were absolute, divinely given word from God. It was that these were the things that they found meaningful, that spoke to them in some way, that they... the word that the Bible itself uses for itself is God-breathed, or that we translate inspired. That's a much more active and vibrant word, breathed. This it's filled with some sort of divine breath or some kind of divine inspiration. That's far less. That's far more fluid than a absolute. These books give you the rules for what you're supposed to believe and how you're supposed to act for forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah, without factoring in any new things that may unfold within the species.
Right. I gotta be honest. I'm a huge Bible nerd. I still am. I was raised to value this book, and so even though my views of what it is has changed, I still love coming back to it in the ways that you were just talking about, understanding the historical context.
Totally.
That has opened my mind and really radically transformed my own views of contemporary society, because as I read it, it's a subversive book. It's a book of a persecuted people that were oppressed under the thumb of empire for centuries, and they're writing to kind of explain how can we create an alternative society that doesn't participate in these oppressive systems of empire. And so you have the story of Abraham coming out of Babylon and out of that kind of early imperial society in Mesopotamia. You have the story of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, out of this another oppressive empire. You have the story of them being carried back into slavery, into Babylon again, and then Persia, and then Rome. And so there's this narrative of people trying to exist within systems and structures of power and oppression.
Empire, yeah.
And how can you live as a different kind of people that doesn't rely on power and violence to exist, and
like the Essenes.
Yeah. Well, so that that's one approach. Is the Essene community says we're just going to withdraw from society. We're going to isolate and do our own thing over here. And then you have groups like the Pharisees that to kind of some of these groups that are around in Jesus' time,
right?
Their approach is, no, the problem is we need to purify society. There were some people that got us off track. We need to exclude those people, and then we'll be fine. And then you have people like the Sadducees and the Herodians that said, we really just need to compromise with Rome. Just learn to get along. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
So you have all these different approaches, and the early Christians step into this context and say, so all of you have some good things here. We're going to offer another approach. Mm-hmm. And their approach is, let's create this radical community, kind of like the Essenes, but that still exists in the midst of the world, mm-hmm. In and among the Roman Empire and Jewish society, to say, what if we were a different kind of society that could actually help change the world over time by just modeling a better way? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you see the early Christians doing for the first 3 or 4 centuries, until the Roman Emperor Constantine comes along and says, hey, maybe we can co-opt this.
Yeah, totally.
Use it as a tool of empire.
Right.
And so the whole thing starts to go a little bit...
Just sanction it.
Sideways at that point, yeah.
So how do you think, those lessons taken from history, how do you think people can take any of that information and apply it to today? In your bio, obviously, it says you're also very interested in activism. So how do you take that wisdom and apply it to activism, and how do you operate within empire, which is what we're doing?
Yeah, no, I mean, we still live within empire. We just give them different names. We call them democracies, or we call them whatever, but it's still systems of power that benefit some and hold others down. And so we're not in a very different situation. For me, so the work that I'm doing, this spiritual transformation project, for me is mostly about bringing together different groups that have really good pieces of things. So in the same way that the Christians kind of went to the Essenes and the Pharisees and Sadducees and said, hey, y'all have some good things here, but we want to let's bring this together. I see my activist friends, they're out there trying to change the world, and they're doing good work and important work, and they're marching in the streets, and I'm often out there with them. Mm-hmm. And yet sometimes you can burn yourself out doing
completely.
that. I mean, you're throwing yourself on the wheel of history trying to change it, and you get broken, and you get angry, and you get frustrated, and you lash out at your people that are your friends and allies sometimes. And so I've seen so many communities tear themselves apart. People that should be on the same side, but they're so overwhelmed by the shit that they're dealing. Sorry, I don't know if that's okay.
That's totally okay. I got the explicit on every episode, just in case. Yeah, because I'm cursed like a sailor, so it's
good. Okay. So you have people that are just kind of burning themselves out trying to change the world. Same thing in the nonprofit world. Even if your focus is on charity and compassion and serving the needs of people, it can just get overwhelming.
Your cup never gets refilled.
No.
Yeah. And this is what's interesting. I'll just say, because I've had this conversation with activist friends, and some of my friends who work in that world, or who have historically done that very thing, they burn themselves out. They become very miserable and unpleasant people, to be honest. And that was something that I noticed really early on. And then you've got a contingent of people who, on the kind of woo side, who just think it's all going to work itself out, and I guess you could say, everything's going to just turn to dust at some point. So I guess that all does work out in the end. But it's like, in the meantime, how do you alleviate suffering? Like, I have the Buddhist background.
Right.
Some people were like, okay, I'm really keen on the non-attachment thing. I'm really good at that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, what was the admonition of the Buddha? It was like, when you become a Buddha, when you become that, when you gain that awareness, part of your responsibility is to come and help liberate people from their own struggles and trials and tribulations. And so, which I think is what Christ was pointing to. Exactly. He's essentially saying, like, when somebody who is in that position, if you take that situation literally and you say, like, oh, how does a guy who's just been nailed up to a cross say, forgive them for they know not what they do, and sort of, because there is a portion of your being that is the flesh part of your being that is not happy with the situation, of course, and the ego is going to, is going to voice that. Mm-hmm. At the same time, if you have that deeper connection to source, whatever you want to call that, then you realize that it's not about you in the meat suit. Like, it's not. It's that part of this is all of it is temporary. So that you can't put a whole bunch of emphasis on that and think that that's going to solve the world's problems. They're not your problems to solve, and yet they are. You know what I mean? So there's this weird sort of juxtaposition of ideas that seem to be in conflict with one another. But what my experience is essentially that and this is why I love yoga, is because it accounts for all of this stuff. This is basically like karma yoga. It's like you work and you do the thing that your karma has brought you here to do without any sense of attachment to outcome. Like you're just doing the work, you know? It's like you're just fighting the battle, but it's also realizing that it's not really your battle.
Yes.
It's the eternal battle, and you're just one of the actors in the play. And if your role is to be the villain, then be a great villain. If your role is to be a hero, then be a great hero. But don't be attached to don't internalize and sort of take on it as it's your personal thing, because it's not yours. You don't own anything. You're here borrowing time and space and real estate and goods and and then it comes and passes through you. And that's what I love about those sort of visuals that the New Testament offers about being the vessel and and allowing yourself to be poured to be poured through and poured out, instead of like, okay, you fill me up, I pour it out, and now I'm empty, I got nothing. You know?
I think the Apostle Paul uses this image of treasure that we have in clay jars, this kind of like this immensely valuable thing that's just in this kind of flawed, broken, fragile shell.
Totally.
And yet it's this beautiful treasure, and it's both are true at the same time. We're just flawed, individual, small human beings, and yet we have this so much potential and so much power, and we get to participate in something that's so much bigger than us.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're saying, that insight from yoga practice, that sounds so similar to what I was raised with in the Christian tradition of, it's not all dependent on you. God is at work, or the Spirit is at work.
Moving through you.
Yeah. And so on one hand, don't stress out, because it's not your job to make sure, to make it all work in the end. That's the Spirit's job.
Right.
And at the same time, it's still your job to do something, to play your role, to have your
up.
piece.
Yeah. Make yourself available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's both empowering and sort of relieving too. To say, okay, I don't have to fix it all on my own.
Yeah.
I have codependent tendencies, so sometimes I feel like it's my job to fix everyone and everything around me.
Totally.
And letting go of that, being willing to release that can be hard for me.
Yeah.
And so that realization is very helpful.
So what is the sort of focus now that you've just got your doctorate? Is it
doctorate?
Is it a doctorate? So now that's a big project.
Yeah.
And and I'm sure you're well happy to be on top of that. Like, where are you taking your energy? Where are you aiming that beam of focus and intention?
Well, so primarily with this spiritual transformation project, and like I said, the goal is to take all of these different groups and these pieces, the folks that are out there trying to change the world, and the folks that are trying to do that inner work of personal health and wholeness, and bring them together into the same space to say, you all have things to share with each other. You all have pieces of the puzzle that you need from each other, and the folks that are out there trying to change the world need to do some of that inner work, and the folks that are doing the inner work need a kick in the ass sometimes to get out there and make a difference in society.
Hide out in your little meditation hovel and
in religious communities, they have a piece to offer too, because they have things like community and intergenerational community. And
totally.
Where else do you go when you have elderly retirees interacting with new babies and everyone in between? That only happens in a few places, and churches are one of those.
Yeah.
And churches often have practices for sustainability and for renewal and refreshment. We get together once a week, in a Sunday service, and you sing songs, and you share bread and wine together, and you hug each other, and it's this kind of this place for renewal every week, and we need that. Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish rabbi from mid-20th century, wrote a whole book on the Sabbath and that importance of these regular rhythms of renewal and refreshment built into even our weekly routine.
Yeah.
So I think each of these different communities have a piece to bring. And so my efforts right now with the Spiritual Transformation Project, it's really a social impact network. I want to create a network where these groups can start to overlap more. And so what I do is I create events where that can happen. Like the event, the Spiritual Practice Salon that you attended. I'm doing a beer and hymns night tonight, which is just a way of kind of saying, hey, let's enjoy some of this old time religion that some of us grew up with, but in sort of an ironic, fun, go out to a bar and drink beer and sing the old Amazing Grace type songs. We also do. I do a theology pub every month, which is a discussion group where we just take a topic and it's a free-flowing discussion, sometimes around social justice issues of race or immigration, sometimes around deeper theological questions of what do we mean when we use words like God? What do we mean? How do we understand the Bible? We had a really good discussion a while back about transgender in the Bible and kind of deconstructing people's assumptions that the Bible is just an anti-LGBT document, that there's actually a lot more complexity and nuance there.
Yeah.
That ancient Judaism had lots of different categories for gender, just something I only knew when I started researching for this pub.
Yeah.
So we have conversations like that. Actually, this Thursday, we have one out at the Community First Village. It's a tiny home community for homeless people here in Austin.
I've been by there. Yeah.
And they have an outdoor theater, and we're going to be showing Children of Men, which is this fantastic post-apocalyptic movie by Alfonso Cuarón, who does great films. And we're going to use that as a launching pad to talk about immigration and refugees and kind of our contemporary society around that. Yeah. So these are all the kinds of things we try to do just to bring people into the same space to share practices, experiences, ideas. The big project is a new festival that's happening almost exactly a year from now, the first weekend of November 2018, here in Austin, called the New Story Festival. And it's going to be a 3-day outdoor event with speakers, musicians, artists, performers to start working on these kinds of things. We say, a festival of community, creativity, and the common good.
Yeah, awesome.
And we're going to have main stage speakers. Possibly, we don't have anyone confirmed yet, so don't quote me on this. But we're thinking people like the Reverend William Barber, who's this well-known civil rights leader in North Carolina. We're thinking, people like Richard Rohr, who's a Catholic mystic from New Mexico.
Oh yeah.
People like Brene Brown, who just writes these fantastic books about kind of personal vulnerability and connection and shame and and all of these things. So people like that are really well-known, big names that can bring together all the different pieces and draw a crowd so that we can be in the same space for just a few days and start to experiment with an alternative form of community, a different way of being in the world.
Have you found that these events that you're doing have drawn people from disparate backgrounds and belief systems, or have they kind of just more attracted the curiosity seeker, kind of like people who probably more or less came from a Judeo-Christian background in the first place, or kind of non-denominational, and they're just so who has been the demographic basically?
There's not much like this out there already. There's one other event called the Wild Goose Festival that happens every summer in North Carolina and has been for the last 7 years. And actually my festival co-partner that's helping me do the New Story was the founding director of the Wild Goose. And that started as sort of a progressive Christian festival, this emerging church movement that I was a part of, as well as kind of the more progressive mainline Christian traditions that have been, on the cutting edge of society for 100 years. A lot of people don't realize that, but actually there are churches like that.
Right.
And they were the ones that started it. So it started as a very Christian thing, but progressive, open-minded Christians. And they've slowly evolved to be a more inclusive or spiritually inclusive space and talk in more general terms about faith and spirituality, but still with a lot of Christian emphases. And that's its primary audience. We're trying to do that too, but with a little bit more of an spiritually inclusive foundation. We don't want this to be a solely Christian space. We want this to be a spiritually inclusive space where Christians and everyone else can come and share the gifts that they have to share with each other.
So we'd be inviting like Buddhist speakers. And,
absolutely, yeah.
Just speakers from different religious faiths and backgrounds. And there's a big Buddhist community here in town, actually. So
absolutely, yeah. We've been talking with a few of the folks from that community about being a part of it in various ways. We've been talking with some of the local Jewish congregations, synagogues, about being involved. So we're starting. There's a couple of more progressive Muslim mosque communities in Austin that we want to reach out to. So yeah, absolutely. We're trying to build those connections, build that network, and there'll be space for each one of those groups to bring their traditions, their rituals to the festival without it being owned by any one particular group. Right.
So let's talk about kind of going back a little bit. What what did you believe about God that you no longer believe?
That's a really good question. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, actually. The image of God that I was raised with, that I think a lot of Christians, and not even Christians, but I think most people have, is that God is this powerful, maybe not old man in the sky, we understand that's a metaphor, but just this powerful dominant figure who's in control of everything and micromanaging everything. And when we pray, we ask for God to use God's power to our benefit, and we think that God can
help my team win.
Right, which is really problematic, because if God's, if both teams are praying that, why is God picking sides? Or help me find this parking spot at the mall. Well, why does God care about the wealthy suburbanites' parking spot and not about the kids dying of AIDS in Africa, or being murdered by warlords, or just dying of diseases that are easily preventable,
or being shot up in the churches that He has them praying in?
For me, it just became increasingly problematic to say that God is in control of everything. Yeah, and yet somehow all of this evil and all this suffering exists, and God somehow is blessing some people and not blessing others, and who knows why. And I just couldn't reconcile that with the vision of God that you find in the New Testament, where Christians say in some sense Jesus was divine, or had some connection to the divine, or we see the divine through Jesus. I don't know how that works. Right. I mean, Christian theologians have tried to define it for centuries.
It's a thick subject.
Right, but in some sense we see what God's like by looking at this person that sacrificed himself on a cross. Like you said, asked for forgiveness for his enemies even while he was dying and hanging there. To me, that paints a different picture of the divine. Or maybe you might, if you want to translate the divine to mean like the base nature of reality, or the nature of the universe itself. That's different than just manipulative power and coercive power. Totally. That's pulling the strings like a puppet master. That's a vision of the divine that releases power, that refuses to control, that refuses to unleash power and dominance and violence against his enemies. That's a power. That's a divine that's willing to suffer, that's willing to be persecuted, that's willing to die. And so one of my favorite theologians, Jürgen Moltmann, says that you can't say anything about God that you couldn't also say about Jesus. So if we're going to say that Jesus was crucified, then we have to say that God himself lets himself be crucified, which I take to mean that God releases whatever power God has to control and manipulate and coerce. Which isn't to say that the divine doesn't have power, but I think that the power of the divine is one of persuasion and love and wooing and calling and inviting. And so when I see God at work in the world, I see God at work in our hearts and our minds to help us to transform and to grow and to become the kind of people who can also let go of our need for revenge or of control, and actually just be open to embracing people, even those that hurt us. That to me is the most radical thing about the Christian tradition, is when Jesus says, love your enemies. Totally. That is, we don't realize how hard that is. I mean, look at any internet forum.
Well, I think people do realize it because they don't do it. Right. That's why they don't bother. Yeah. They go back to no, it's the eye for an eye. That's the part that I'm really into.
Right. And we don't, and we don't even want to. We don't even want to try anymore. We want to vilify our enemies and say these people are inherently evil and deserve to be eradicated. Punished. Yeah, and that happens on the left and the right. Totally. I mean, I'm a pretty progressive guy, but I have a lot of progressive friends that would just as soon see all of the Trump supporters deported, right? From the country, and want to demonize and villainize them. And I have a lot of sympathy for that, but I also say that's not going to get us where we need to go in the end. Yeah. We actually have to learn to not dehumanize our enemies. We have to learn how to invite them to live into their better selves. And how do we do that?
There's a great interview that I just even want to use that term into like more or agenda oriented things, like what does it mean to live a good life or whatever. What does it mean to be have the human experience and participate in this lila, what they call the grand lila, this grand play, and what is your role? And there's an interesting neutrality to it in from their perspective in terms of God's role. And one of the sort of fractures for me, I remember in my Christian upbringings, was that it was like there's the statement, God is the Alpha and the Omega, which to me was pretty inclusive. It pretty much encompassed a lot, pretty much everything that you could fit in there.
Yeah.
And so when it was like time to assign blame or to give credit, it was like, oh no, well that's the devil.
Right.
And no, this is God. So there was just this constant like, oh, God gets this, checkbox for him, and this sort of thing going on, and to me it was like, okay, if God is the Alpha and the Omega, the bookends of this entire narrative, there's not really any room in there for anything but God.
Yeah.
And then, so that was my thinking. And then when I, read the text, the Vedic text and things like that, it's like, basically, yeah, that's what we're saying.
Yeah.
It's like, there is no room for anything but God. So all these other derivations are still manifestations of God in the sense that God's the purveyor of it all. So whatever other thing emanates, it's kind of like, the truth is the truth. The big bubble is the truth. And if you tell a lie, you're still under the umbrella of the truth. Now, you may lie to your friends, or you may lie to your community or whoever, but at the end of the day, like, you've still spoken it within the context of the bubble of truth. So you're the only one who's sort of the dummy in this equation, because you're sort of moving away from what is the natural flow of things.
Well, and so that's... Yeah, so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that recognition that everything is connected and everything is part of this bigger picture that we call God or whatever. And that's one of the valuable things that the Eastern philosophies and the Eastern traditions bring to us. The Western traditions, and by that I mean Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they have a different approach to it, which is to say there is such a thing as evil, there is such a thing as falsehood, there is, or if we don't want to use those kind of abstract terms, there's a sense in which we look at the world and say that things are not yet the way they ought to be. Mm-hmm. And I think like that's indisputable when you look at people, churches being shot up in South Texas, or you look at children that are dying, from diseases. I mean, there's just things that you look at and our heart breaks, and we just at a gut level say this is not the way things ought to be. Mm-hmm. And there are things that we would look at, things that human beings do that, like ISIS or the Nazis or whoever, that say no, that is just wrong. It's there's something categorically evil about this. And so the Western traditions say that the world is not yet the way it ought to be, that there is a sense in which it's still in progress. It's not finished yet, and it all comes from God and it all ends in God, but it's still in process now. And we have a role in helping it get from there to from here to there.
Right.
And I think there's wisdom in both to say that, yes, this is all included in the unfolding of the divine, but it's still okay to say some things are not okay.
Right.
Some things are tragic, and we get to work to change those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd say that the Vedas would agree with that too. I mean, all those tales from the Upanishads are basically like, hey, I can't remember the name of the character, but it's the great battle. He's kind of conferring with a deity, a demigod or whatever, and he's like, hey, these are my relatives. Like, why I'm on the battlefield here having to, like, am I supposed to kill my own relatives? And they're like, he's like, basically, yeah. Like, this is your role here. You're a soldier in this army. You're here to defend this contingent of people, and your role is to just go out there and do what you're supposed to do in this context, and know that this is part of the sort of grander plan or whatever, but it's talking about that personal transformation model, and obviously you are steeped in Joseph Campbell, as one would be in your field. Do you agree with this idea that the Western model is much more of an authority obedience model, and the Eastern model is much more of an inner transformation model? And how do you reconcile those? Because you were saying, the world isn't as it ought to be, right?
Yep.
And we can all agree on certain things, but then you could say, the contingent of, let's just, an obvious example, Trump supporters would say, well, the world isn't the way it ought to be because immigrants are running all amok, or whatever that narrative. I mean, this is an example. Or the left, and it's like, oh, because Trump supporters exist in the first place, or whatever. Like, I mean, I'm not taking a position in that, but I'm just saying, like, that's the sort of this. It's so subjective, is my point. Yep. And so, where can we, and this was what I was going to ask in the work that you're doing, is where do you find, like, how much shit do you have to pull away from this conversation to get to the fundamental root of the human condition, where people are no longer grabbing onto ideologies that don't actually have anything to do with reality, but that are, if they can even be supported, they're supported thinly by evidence and history and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. That's like people gravitate and embolden their egos by belief systems, most of which don't have any merit at all. So, and for me, the value, the sort of liberating factor is to really release all of those, is to take what was an otherwise full chalkboard of nonsense that was handed to me from my teachers and preachers and mother and father and all that kind of stuff, and erase that shit so that I'm looking at a blank chalkboard, which is nihilism for a time, you know, which comes to this place of like, fuck it, it's all just nonsense and people are out of their mind. So I might as well just make it up too, whatever. But then and that's a scary place, because moral ambiguity that comes from that is powerful, in the sense that you could do whatever and not feel any guilt or shame, which is normally accompanied by religion, at least for my background. And so that opens you to be, you know, like that kind of narrative in certain religions that say, you know, you become as God. You know, it's kind of like Diary of a Vampire or Memoir, or whatever that one with Tom Cruise, where it was like, God kills, you know, frivolously or whatever he said, and so shall we, or something like that. And so, but then you step back, and then there is that sense of like ought that comes back in, and then you start to rebuild a belief system. I don't even use that term, but a faith or a spiritual life that somehow comes in, and I'm not say I can't say that it's not tainted by all of that stuff anyway, but it comes in with at least much less saddled with baggage than the former version. There's much more of an honest approach to that, and part of that for me is having the wherewithal to see through what is just your personal preferences for how life should be. Like, oh, I prefer the temperature to be 75. They prefer it to be 74. Like, these are, so much of this stuff is just preferential, you know, when you're talking about, and you talk about, you know, for me, like, the activism goes well beyond, like, whatever the fuck humans are doing. It's like, when you talk about, like, and I do this, I'm guilty of it, man. I just wiped out a whole colony of ants on my porch the other day. Like, you know, it's like the horror show never ends in terms of, like, our species has decided, well, it's important for humans to exist. Okay, but at the expense of every other species on the planet. To those ants, you are
the destroyer. You are Satan.
Totally.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you, you know, as a person of faith, it's like, how do you, you know, the Buddhist, I love the Buddhist approach, but it's like hardly practical, you know. It's like, if you're true, it's like, no, save every worm, don't smack mosquitoes, like, everything has a right to live. Like, no, man, cockroaches gotta die, mosquitoes gotta die, you know. So then it goes back to this, the natural world doesn't give a shit. Like, if you're out in the wilderness and you don't know how to survive, God ain't gonna save you, in my opinion. You know, like, you are part of the ecosystem, and you're is food just as much as everything else out there is food for something, you know. And if you've got the wherewithal via power or intelligence or strength or whatever or a gun or whatever your asset is, then your power usurps the power of the next thing, which is the thing you're going to put in your mouth or will put you in its mouth. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely,
how that starts to get really convoluted in terms of values and morals and what ought to be.
I believe that the whole universe is interconnected, and the consciousness that arises in humanity and other forms of life, and I would say the universe itself is conscious, and that's what I call God. That you don't get the ought, the is versus ought, until you get to that level of consciousness. And so that's one of the gifts that humanity can bring to the world, is to say, yes, I can destroy that anthill or whatever. Should I or not? And maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. I mean, that's a complex ethical question. But for me, that the way you resolve the kind of that nihilism that you're talking about, and that kind of question of, you know, how do we balance just that personal discovery versus our responsibilities to others around us, is through compassion. And by compassion, I mean that encounter with the other where you realize that your needs or their needs are an identity as an independent being is just as real and just as important as your own. That's the basis of all ethics. That's the basis of all morality, of all oughtness, is just that encounter that we have with another person or even another being.
And when you say needs, define that.
The need to live, to flourish, to find happiness and comfort and joy and pleasure in life, to not suffer. I mean, just these basic, it's not complicated. I mean, it's just the basic things that we all want: security, belonging, comfort, and to not to hunger and to not to suffer. I mean, these, and we want these things for ourselves. We have these desires that we try to meet, and then we encounter other people and we realize, oh, they have the same desires and they're trying to meet them too. And sometimes our needs clash or conflict or what we think we need. And so then we're faced with a choice. Am I going to only prioritize the self and my needs, or am I going to prioritize others as well? And that doesn't take complex moral philosophy. That's just the human condition. We all are born into this realization that we are not the sole, existing beings in the universe, and so we have to decide what we're going to do about that.
Emmanuel, what are we going to do about that?
Emmanuel Levinas was this Jewish philosopher, wrote post-Holocaust philosophy, and he describes it as the encounter with the face of the other. You come face to face, and you realize that, oh wow, they are equally valuable. And how am I going to respond? And you choose. He was an existentialist, and I kind of am too. Existentialists basically say you have to make a choice. You can be a nihilist. You can choose to say none of this means anything, and I should just live for myself, for my own pleasure, or whatever. Or you can choose to live in interconnection and compassion. You can choose to value those others as yourself. And there's nothing, no authority structure, no God, no anything that can hold the sword over you and say you have to choose this way and not that way. You actually get to make that choice. And some people choose nihilism, and some people, and we tend to call those people psychopaths or sociopaths. But actually, I think more of us than realize sometimes choose that path of self before others, my needs before all other needs. And so I'm encouraged. I feel like my work is to encourage people to choose the other path, to say, actually, we're all interconnected. I exist because we exist. This is the African word Ubuntu. Ubuntu. That we actually, you wouldn't have an existence without your parents, without your community, without your, and so you come into this world already owing people your very life.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I had that conversation the other day, basically saying, none of the, especially when you're talking like really ambitious entrepreneurs and that kind of talk, that kind of mindset. It's like, oh, I'm just the man or woman out here doing it all, making it all, having a hustle. It's like blah blah blah. But it's like, man, you don't got shit. Like, you don't control the air that you breathe, which you don't make your food. Like all of the things that you rely on to be the man, you have no control over. Like, I mean, you could hold your breath maybe and stop being in denial of that or whatever, but it's like these things are all gifts to you without question, and those are the things that we value least and need most. But what I wanted to say, going back to what you were saying, is these are not complex philosophical or moral sort of things but I think what is complex is and again this is keep referencing the work of like yoga, is to like dismantle the ego to the point that it strip away those layers, and it's like the whole civilization,
it's a lot easier said than done.
The whole society is built around creating an ego and reinforcing that ego through a million means, consumerism and celebrity.
Well, I think our society in particular.
Totally. Yeah. It's like, and when I was living in Australia, one of my buddies was married to Papua New Guinean. Well, she's part Papua New Guinean and part Aussie. And what he realized in traveling in her culture was that, and this goes for a lot of cultures, that what he called heart cultures and head cultures. Westerners are head culture people, and a lot of these sort of what we call developing world countries, the Polynesians, the Philippine, that region, even the Aborigines, like all of these people, these are heart oriented people, and so they process very differently, and that's why you say like the Latins are so passionate, and that whole thing, and like the Germans are so everything on time and everything efficient in the block, and so you can see these things, these sort of like cliched.
Funny sidebar: my master's degree was in intercultural studies, so these are exactly the differences. Yeah, they are.
And so it's like finding, and even as you sort of read the histories of. Like I'm reading, I think it's like, what is it, Sex at Dawn? Have you read that book? Great book. And it's talking about these cultures that, when the explorers were out there, the Spanish and the English and all these people, and they'd find these civilizations where everything was just like, in the community, everything was just, freely given, It's like, what was that? The gods must be crazy. You remember that, where the Coke bottle lands into and he's got to get this thing out of here because now everybody wants the Coke bottle. I own the Coke bottle. So it's this idea of that really speaks to the interconnectedness, and that in the sense that in that way tribalism works because those people are so codependent and so co-reliant on each other for everything that. They actually feel that connection where we have been, each of us individually put out to pasture in a way where it's like, hey man, rugged individualism, go out there and sort yourself out.
And there's so much about our society that has just conspired to create that kind of individualistic narrative.
Right.
Let's not trash it entirely. There's a lot to be said for people who can go against the flow,
totally,
and buck
you have to have
the things that they've been told. And every Disney movie, I don't know, I'm thinking of Mulan. I have kids, where it's like, you don't have to be constrained by the norms of society. You can go and fulfill your destiny. There's something noble and valuable about that too. So I want to say the
and
Western
indigenous
tradition,
cultures have that. I mean, that's where you get the shaman,
right?
Basically, those Joseph are the crazy people.
The myth of the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell talks about. This is the journey of the person who leaves home and turns his back on his family in order to go have his own experience, but
and to bring something of value
to come back to a community that
help them.
It's a both
raise
and.
The boat.
It's not. It shouldn't have to be community versus individual, and yet we've created a society where we so devalue community.
Yeah.
It's so deeply historically rooted. It's centuries old, and I can't point to like the one thing that caused us to be individualistic and atomized versus communal and collective like these other societies, but a lot of it has to do with racism, with slavery, with the institutions of slavery. It has to do with the displacement of indigenous peoples. It has to do with kind of capitalism and the rise of industrial society. We created this society in which we needed to justify the destruction of collectivist communities, of saying, well, how can we justify ripping people away from their families and enslaving them and selling off their children for profit? How can we create a society that justifies uprooting the native people of the land and forcing them, exterminating or forcing them elsewhere? How can we justify a society that forces people to work in sweatshop conditions for the benefit of a few owners? And so through the evolution of these systems of slavery, of indigenous displacement, of capitalism, we created a mythos or an identity that says that it's all about the individual and what they can get for themselves, and it's not about the collective good or the common good. And so these patterns that we live into and that we feel in our own day-to-day lives of disconnection or alienation, they are rooted in centuries of social programming and social systemic structures. And so for me, it's always a both and. You can't have the personal transformation without the social transformation. But you can't transform society without also starting with what you were saying, with that the one thing you can control, which is your own self and your own transformation. So you got to have both.
How do you live in integrity as these sort of awarenesses unfold? When you realize that the tentacles, how deep the tentacles, like for example, you use the phones, like, okay, we want to blame Apple or whoever,
right?
And they're, but we're buying them. There's lines of people standing out for the new iPhone X, right? It's like we're complicit in this game, and so there was a moment that I had during a really intense meditation where I had that visceral experience of cellular dissolution into the oneness of the cosmos, you know what I mean, minus any drugs. Like a really just that, where I experienced that in a super loving, super deeply connected, like I am everything and everything is me, and and that's super powerful. And thankfully, I had that experience because it gave me a reference point to hold on to, even though I've never been able to recreate that naturally. But it gave me a reference point, and I realized, like, in that moment, I could just piss off into a cave right now and just focus on doing that. Like, if that's where it's at, man, I'm good. Like, everything else seems very irrelevant compared to that. And yet, I feel like I couldn't. I didn't feel like that was right. It was that sort of question of, like, now that you have a reference point for that, you need to share that reference point and try and get people on that same wavelength. But I struggle with the fact that, like, how much do you, and I'm part of this whole movement for us about finding and or creating intentional community, conscious community, is about disconnecting from the systems of what are essentially oppressive and destructive systems. The way we produce food, the gadgets and the consumerism and the planned obsolescence, like all of these things that go into this life that we live that we don't even think twice about. Like, all of those things are causing harm, and even, I've hung around, like, Buddhists and, like, real Buddhists, like actual monks. It's like, and, like, I was doing a documentary and I saw them doing the sand painting, and they're, like, doing the sand painting and drinking Coca-Cola and, of course, having to be driving around in cars and doing all this kind of stuff as they were being toured around from place to place. And it's like we're all complicit, even if we're personally living a really austere life. It's like Al Gore, he got so railed for, like, flying around in his jet from thing to thing to talk about global warming. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? What is your footprint right now?
You've perfectly named that tension between the complicity and just, like, being immersed in the system and maybe trying to change it from within. So, I mean, I'm sure that's what Al Gore thought he was doing was, I'm going to use up this carbon, whatever, flying around, but it's for the greater good. The impact that I'll have outweighs the negative sides. I'm sure that's, the calculation he's making. And it's okay to make those calculations ourselves to say, society needs to change. It's not going to change if I completely move out to the woods into a cabin and never talk, never get online again and never drive anywhere again. That's not helping anyone.
Right.
It's reducing my footprint, but it's not serving the greater good. At the same time, we do need to find alternatives, and we need to start practicing alternatives. And so these intentional communities, alternative communities, we need that too. The people are going to experiment with, how can we do this better? How can we start over? And so, I mean, this is one of the things I'm hoping the festival will be about, is it'll be this experimental community where we can start to work together on solutions. There's this Catholic mystic I mentioned, Richard Rohr, he has this quote that says, the best critique of the bad is the practice of the better. And that's at the heart of what we want to do for this festival. It's not going to be a festival where we stand up and we complain about everything that's wrong in the world. There's plenty we could say about that. It's going to be a place where we say, let's start working on the solutions. What are the alternatives so that we can reduce our complicity? But we're not going to shame each other for not being perfectly disconnected from the system yet either, because we do want to work for change, and so you have to participate a little bit. Now here's where I see the difference. I mean, this has been a historical tension in the Christian tradition, is that the more you get engaged with the system in order to change it, the more you get corrupted by the system. That, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
And so the more power you have for good, the more potential you have for evil as well. And we've seen a lot of evil that has come out of well-meaning people that get power and then end up doing horrible things with it. I slammed the Emperor Constantine a while back, for co-opting Christianity in the service of the Roman Empire. But probably Constantine thought he was trying to do some good through it. Maybe he thought he was going to change the empire a little bit by bringing Christianity into it. I don't know. It's a tough calculation. The difference for me is radical nonviolence, which is something that pops up both in the Christian tradition and in the Eastern traditions. This idea of rather than trying to change society through power and coercion and imposing your way on other people, you again come back to, we're going to change through love and persuasion and a willingness to sacrifice and suffer even in the face of our enemies. Mm-hmm. And so this is the way that Dr. King tried to bring about change. This is the way that Gandhi has tried to bring about change. This is the way that Jesus, I think, why Jesus went to the cross, was to say, rather than trying to change my enemies by killing them and oppressing them the way they've been doing to me, I'm going to try to change them by demonstrating a way of radical love and compassion and nonviolence. And so I want to change the world, and I think we need to stay engaged in the world to change it, but we change it through persuasion and nonviolence and demonstration and inclusion, by approaching people with that lens of compassion that I was talking about earlier.
Do you believe that violence is a uniquely human thing?
Oh, no. I mean, you see violence throughout nature. It's that struggle for my needs versus your needs.
Yeah.
That's where, and that's why I say it is a higher way. It's the something that only beings that have a sense of consciousness and self-awareness are able to step back and say, oh, maybe violence isn't actually solving our problems. It seems like the right answer, but this doesn't. But all it does is produce more violence. That we talk about the cycles of violence. That violence begets violence, and it just escalates.
Do you think that is true in the natural world, though?
Well, I mean, I guess you would say, animals are pretty violent to one another. Is there something you're thinking of in particular?
My friend wrote a post about violence the other day, and it was kind of hinting to what you're talking about. And I think one of the fundamental things, this is a total rift in my brain, but that as I look at as you observe the natural world, it seems pretty much built into the entirety of the system that we exist in, cosmologically. That violence is a natural part of that. And again, this kind of goes back to the beauty of sort of the Hindu thing is like the destroyer. Like,
right.
This is like things come into existence and they have their day, and then they go back to wherever they started from. And you step back out, it's like, okay, well, that gives a whole fucking latitude to all kinds of horrors, which none of us want to be a part of. So, you have to bring it back in, but it feels like the violence that we refer to as a human, and again, like we think of, okay, so like radical nonviolence, like, are we going to extend that to every creature? Every sentient being? Where do those, it would be good if we could start just with ourselves.
Right.
But the fact that we've been a total failure in that for the entirety of human history leads me to believe that it may not even be realistic. It may there's a proponent in our biology that can never be too altruistic, because that's also not good for the species.
That's true too. Yeah, you don't need to be a doormat. You don't need to kind of. So let me bring this back to religious terms.
Sure, yeah, please.
Jesus says, "Love your neighbor as yourself," or "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you."
Yeah,
both of those. There's a concern for yourself alongside your concern for others.
Right.
Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Well, you got to love yourself first, or you're not going to be able to love your neighbor. If you're not taking care of yourself, you'll have nothing to give to them.
Right.
If you're not, if you devalue yourself and think of yourself,
which many people do, subsequently treat everyone else around them in kind.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is why people that have been abused and hurt and have a poor self-image tend to lash out and hurt and abuse others. Is because they're just projecting their own feelings, onto others. And so you start with love and concern and compassion for yourself, self-compassion. Yeah. As my friend Kristen Neff, who lives here locally and works at UT, she writes about self-compassion as a advancement beyond just self-care. Self-care is when you have wine and bubble bath and chocolate and you just kind of indulge yourself when you're having a bad day. Self-compassion is when you actually look at yourself through the lens of love and say, if I was my own best friend, what would I tell myself to do to really take care of myself?
Reparenting is something that I've sort of found valuable. After having a child, there's this moment that when he was probably 1 or around that age, it was typical of a child. We tried to train him to sleep in his crib, and he was not having it. Yeah. He was just screaming, and I was like, I could feel myself just getting like, so agitated, and the thing that popped into my head was like, because I didn't have this. I mean, I think my mom did, but my dad definitely did not have the compassion or the wherewithal to be patient. 20 years old, they don't know anything. And so I just had that little switch in my mind before I went over there, or as I was going over there, and I was just like, act as if he is you, and treat him in that way.
Yeah.
And so I picked him up and I just like cuddled him and held him and just was super, super compassionate with him, and it just softened. The whole thing just softened. It was just like a beautiful analogy or lesson for me to like, okay, that is that sense of like, no, give that to yourself.
Yes.
Always.
You have to do both. It's not, nonviolence does not mean just letting people walk over you and
sometimes, I mean, and again, like this goes in the personal development thing. It's the Zen master stick. I mean, and this is, it's in the Eastern philosophy. What I learned was it's not the thing, but the how or the motive of the thing. And so when you it's like if you're, and you see this in the guru culture too, it's like you get a guru who gets power, they become just ding-dongs and do all kinds of manipulative bullshit, totally self-serving. But then you have the occasional one who actually is the thing that they profess to be, and they are coming from a place of as neutral as a human can be. And so as they're looking at you, they're not looking at you of like, what do I need in relationship to this other? It's more like, okay, I'm seeing you as you're presenting yourself,
right? And
what comes to me is that I'm to be overly compassionate in this moment, in the overt terms, like that sort of, what we can think of as that. It would actually enable you and be a disservice to you. So what you actually need is a kick in the ass, which I'm going to give to you, and you may not like that, but at the end you're going to come around. It's the same thing as parenting your child. Yeah. It's like I'm being harsh with you right now to imprint in your mind that this is a bad choice, and you will thank me later when you don't make that choice because you realize...
I talk about... Exactly. I confessed earlier that I'm codependent or have been in the past, and it's not actually codependent. You think that you're just giving of yourself and sacrificing of yourself for the good of the other person. But you actually realize that's not helpful to that person if you're not establishing firm boundaries. You, like you said, you're just enabling their self-destructive behavior. So I use the term nonviolence. I don't think that nonviolence necessarily means that you don't resist evil. The classic example is World War II. Right. Should we have resisted Hitler? Well, yeah. I mean, that's not to say the Allies were necessarily doing it for the right reasons at the time.
Right.
They had their own motivations. But yes, you should resist the person that's exterminating whole,
huge
ethnic
communities
groups.
of people. Yeah.
Yeah. That and it's okay to use tanks and bombs and planes for that.
Right.
I think.
Right.
In a smaller sense, so you remember Charlottesville happened a few months ago in the neo-Nazi alt-right uprising there, and then there was a counter-protest, and it got real violent, late August, I guess.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of friends that were on the front lines of that. It's several clergy friends, Brian McLaren, who I mentioned earlier, a young woman named Brandy Daniels, who used to be in my church, and they were there with Cornel West, who's this real powerful justice leader, and philosopher and theologian. Anyway, they were there on the front lines to provide a nonviolent witness against the alt-right and the neo-Nazis. And yet the neo-Nazis were violently attacking them and charging them. My friends could have died. And Antifa stepped up and beat them back and fought them off and protected my friends' lives. And now Antifa wasn't there and provoking or initiating the violence, according to my friends. It was responsive. It was defensive. I think that's appropriate. I don't think that's against the spirit of nonviolence to say sometimes it's okay to stand in the way of people that are trying to hurt you and say that's not allowed. You can't. I'm not going to let you hurt this person because it's not good for that person, but it's also not good for you. You're destroying your own soul.
Yeah.
Now, do that non-lethally as much as possible.
Right.
Like if you have to use self-defensive violence, use it in a way that allows the possibility of redemption and restoration for the person that's attacking you.
Yeah.
Because I do not believe there's anyone that's beyond hope or beyond redemption. I think even the neo-Nazi can be turned around and come to realize their mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And this comes, again, through the lens of compassion. At the end of the day, no one thinks that they are the bad guy. No one thinks that they're setting out to do evil. They think that what they're doing is good. Well, why? Because all of us at our core are trying to get at our basic needs, our needs for security, for belonging, for acceptance, for love. that's the and I would say the neo-Nazi is trying to do that too. They feel like there's something valuable to them, their identity, their their heritage, their sense of self-worth, that they believe is under attack by these people that they scapegoat, immigrants, black people, women, whoever, and they're wrong. They're wrong to scapegoat those people. They're wrong that their sense of security and identity and acceptance is dependent on them belittling those other people and taking away security and belonging, acceptance from other people.
Yeah.
But their desire for those things is not wrong. Right. The desire to be secure and
feel safe and secure.
Right.
And feel like,
And so I want to see that desire in those people and say, how can I speak to that desire and help pull them away from their belief, their false belief that they have to deny those things to others in order for them to have those things. It's moving from a scarcity mentality to an abundance mentality to say there actually is enough for all of us, and we don't have to fight over my needs versus your needs. If we actually care about each other's needs and our own at the same time, there's actually going to end up being enough for all. So.
What do you think what role do you think technology plays in the salvation of the human species?
The jury's still out. No, I mean, honestly, that's a really hard question to answer. My dissertation was on this emerging church movement. I'm going to use this as an example. On the one hand, it couldn't have happened without technology. The internet in particular. It grew up at the same time as the internet. Late mid-90s to early 20-teens. It exists because people were able to find each other that were asking the same questions, that maybe there was one or two in a particular church and they would have never been able to start a movement by themselves, but with the internet they could find people, the two or three in every other church.
Like-minded,
So that's beautiful, that's wonderful, and the leaders of it, and even myself as an academic of it, study of it, has defined it primarily as a conversation. It was never a big movement or an institution. It was a conversation among friends enabled by technology. On the other hand, a big part of the reason this movement fizzled and dissipated and didn't fulfill its potential was because people didn't know how to use technology in a way that didn't tear each other down and tear each other apart. And by the end of the emerging church movement, people were at each other's throats online, on blogs, on social media.
Interesting.
Just, using it in destructive, violent ways.
Wow.
Like you do. I mean, we didn't...
Yeah, exactly.
We didn't know in the early 2000s...
Twitter, we're talking to you.
Yeah, we didn't know what a flame war was. We didn't know...
I still don't think I know what that is.
And yet we figured out what it was because we did it to each other.
Yeah.
We tore each other apart in the name of being right or in the name of whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think...
Standing on your moral podium...
just like any other tool that humans come up with, it has potential for great good and great evil, and I hope that and this, it's not going to be our salvation. We have other work to do to learn how to use those tools appropriately. I found the liberation greatly accentuated by not having as many horses in the race, not having as many positions to defend. Yes.
I can really see, and I think the seeds were always there, but there was definitely a time in my history where I felt like I really had to defend stuff, I really had to defend. I remember having these conversations about gay rights back in, God, what was it? It was like the 90s when I worked at this record store, and my manager, her sister was lesbian or whatever, and it wasn't like super heated, just having these conversations with her about homosexuality and God and religion and Christian faith and blah blah blah. And I remember sort of like after my own awakening of just sort of apologizing for just being such a knothead about it. But there were these positions back in the day where I felt like I had to defend, and after that sort of experience of, well, none of it fucking matters. That was actually really liberating, because it was like people could just be like, and I could just have a good time in conversations and play devil's advocate. So it was a Christian talking about something, I just rail on, some point to just like push and provoke their Christian dogmatic beliefs. And if it was somebody from the other side, I'd play the Christian thing and push and but without any animosity, because like I actually don't give a shit. Like it comes out in the end like, I'm just playing with you. I don't actually care. And there was a great liberation in that. But at the same time, it can be a slippery slope to just a lack of empathy.
Right.
You know, it's like you just stop caring because it's like, well, this is just the world.
Well,
it's almost like a fatalist kind of.
It can be a position of privilege too, because when you're not when you're not in one of those categories that's vulnerable, it's easy to play devil's advocate or treat it as a game. When you're the person whose life is under threat because of discrimination, it's a lot more serious. And so I always try to check my privilege as a cis-het white male to say, okay, when do I need to be... Yeah, it doesn't have to be my fight. I can just back off and say it doesn't really matter to me, but maybe it needs to be my fight because I'm not the one that's under threat here.
Right.
So that's been the challenge for me because I was the same person. I mean, on both sides. I was the person on the conservative side attacking people and defending what I believe was true and right and good. Because again, no one thinks that they're being evil.
Right.
They think that they're on the side of good. And then on the other side, I've been the social justice warrior, and I say that term with all affection, but that was attacking and tearing people down on the other side too, because I felt like what I was doing was really important too.
Yeah.
And it's my inclination these days is what you've said, is to step back and not have as many hills I have to die on.
Yeah.
And so I try to choose the hills that I have to die on based on who is vulnerable that needs me to help protect or come alongside or lift them up and empower them.
Yeah.
But it still is good to not have as many things that you're reactive about and defensive about and willing to fight about.
Yeah.
And that comes from a place of personal security.
Totally.
I think we attack and we defend and we fight because we feel insecure.
Totally.
In our identities.
What are we lacking?
In our beliefs, yeah. And the more solid and stable and secure you can be, and I am who I am, and I'm okay in that.
Yeah.
And I don't need to prove myself to the world.
Which is the whole personal development concept.
Yes, exactly.
Which I think, for me, what I realized, too, as deeply exploring as deeply as I have in the sort of movement of personal development, was the really fundamental value of the Christian narrative of death and rebirth.
Yes.
Like, until you die to all of that old narrative about yourself, what you do is just continually add more nonsense and more dogma. No matter what new dogma you picked up, like, oh, I'm not a Christian anymore, I'm a Buddhist. Now I'm going to be dogmatic about Buddhism, or now I'm going to be dogmatic about yoga, or now I'm going to be, it's like, man, until you've got to clean the slate. I mean, Joseph Campbell talks about that in terms of relating it to software. It's like, it's not really that good to just keep layering one OS on top of another OS unless those OSs are really resonant and sympathetic to one another.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you just fuck up the whole thing. So it's like, if you're going to be a Christian and that's your thing, really work that, but work that from a place of understanding that the non-literal version of that, and whatever thing you pick. And some people are fine as dabblers and can just extract. And he was one of those characters who, his analogies, I've dug 1,000 tiny wells, and I've probably missed out on an experience that somebody who really goes deeply into the gnosis of a spiritual path would experience. But that's just been my path, So it's like, find your thing, but just really, and I see this with artists, I've interviewed artists, and I realize, like, there's a certain kind of artist who's much more of a dabbler, who's a concept artist, who wants to, like, experiment with this material and this, form and this style. And then there's another artist who goes, no, I'm going to take this one thing and I'm going to extract every nuance possible out of this one style until I've sucked it dry like a vampire. Like, there's no juice left in it for me. And then 10 years later, I'll go into my blue period, or go into my other phase. And I think it can be paralleled in the spiritual path too. It's like there are people who go deeply, deeply into it but they do it in a way that's not like, I need this to is a power, as a way to, like, I'm right and you're wrong. It's more of just like, this is a deep personal exploration, and I'm going to use this costume, I guess, in a way. It's like it's just like, okay, this is a particular language or a thing that I feel comfortable with because of my own upbringing or whatever. Right. Literally the only truth, the only way, the only path in, and you find that I found that with Buddhists in Thailand. I mean, like traveling around, or in Chinese Buddhists too, the same way. Like they're very dogmatic. I'm like, you guys realize where your religion comes from, right? It's not Chinese.
Yeah.
You've made it Chinese, but it's not coming from. The Buddha was Indian. You understand? You know, so it's like, but you just see it's the nature of. And so to me, like when we talk about like what are the roots of it, I think that's why the personal transformation aspect has to be dealt with, because it's like. What techniques, what approaches do we need to unravel all of this nonsense that separates us from other? Another point I was going to say, and I think it's a contention with what you say, like most people, I think you're saying that nobody feels like they're the bad guy,
right?
You know, but I would say that, and I say this coming from personal experience, that certain people have been so trained about their badness that they actually identify with being a bad person, and it's almost and you can either, and so there's the person who's in conflict with that, like, oh, I'm a bad person, and I just, you know, and you hear them always just like slagging on themselves, and when clearly they're not any worse than anybody else. But then there's those who are just like, no, I'm a bad person, and I've taken that, and I fully accept that to make a supervillain, basically, is what I'm saying. Like, people who have really adopted that idea. I mean, we're talking about sociopathic tendencies, or these kind of neurological disorders, that, however they happen, you know, through diet or through programming or some combination of both. And then that sort of reinforced, it's like that. It's not as simple as just going, no, you're a good person, you know, let's just get underneath. And it's like, well, actually, you're just a person, but within the context of society, your value structure and the rest of us is a mismatch. So, you know, it's like that song from Rush, The Killer Instinct, I don't want to face. So we keep it under lock and key. What do you do with it? What's the most compassionate thing that you can do to people who are not readily converted to your way of thinking?
I absolutely see what you're saying, and that's absolutely true. I mean, there are people, and whether it's because they were
small contingent, like this really isn't a super big problem in the sense that, but if you have them running countries,
true,
and if you have them, you know, at the helm of military powers, like this can be a real
I still want to see those people as broken, wounded, scarred individuals, like they're reacting out of a place of pain and a place of damage in their own lives. And I think even those people, they're still responding to needs and desires that are at their root good and valid. You know, and so, not to psychoanalyze Donald Trump, but he probably just wants his dad to love him. Right? And that's all he really wants, is for people to realize that he is good enough and smart enough, and the things he does are, you know, wonderful and excellent, and he just wants people to, you know, he just ultimately wants his dad to approve of him. Right. And we all get to see the, you know, the fallout from that as he does it on the national scale. But it's not a bad thing to want that approval or that whatever. And yet when you make that existential choice that I was talking about earlier, to I'm not going to care about anybody else's needs except my needs, that's when you get those sociopathic, psychopathic behaviors and tendencies.
I mean, because even I've read literature about the Maoist revolution, and I read a lot of stuff that led me to believe that early on in the Maoist revolution, there was quite a benevolent ideology at work. I mean, he was telling his soldiers as they were traipsing across China, running from Chiang Kai-shek, you know, when you encounter the farmers and the people of the land, like, treat them well, help them, take care, you know, offer your service to them. And like, there was a lot of benevolence in that mindset, but it's just like, it went sideways so bad. And now it sort of, you know, it got to the point where, and this reminds me of what the left is kind of doing now, where, you know, you're not Mao enough. Like, you're not reading this book and you're not interpreting it clearly enough. And so now we just start eating our own.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that.
And it's like, where do these things, like, you know, what thing do you have to, like, hold on to so that it doesn't so that it doesn't become corrupt, that the best intentions, like all these sort of pure communism and pure socialism and pure, these purist ideas that have the best intentions, but 500,000 people got to die in the process, or whatever that looks like, to achieve this grand utopian vision. It's like, how do you what do we as humans have to stay? To me, it's like, again, the moment, and this is why I love aspects of this sort of the Jesus narrative, is there really is this sense of like, my needs are provided for from a higher source. Therefore, there's a book that you should read that I think you would really appreciate, called The Man Who Gave Up Money. And like, if you listen to it, you can find talks on YouTube. You listen to him, you think, like, if there was ever a modern day Jesus, this would be the guy, because he's so about the natural flow. He's like, we're the only species who has account books. We like are constantly accounting for, like, oh, I did this for you, now you owe me this, tit for tat, tit for tat. And he's like, and for me, it's like, God is the provider of all of these things anyway, and I trust that. And yes, these people or these situations will be factors in that, and they'll be sort of tools to whatever God's end is, but ultimately it's like, see the lilies in the field, are ye not more important than they are? It's like that real trust, and like, okay, my meat suit is not the most important, and all of the things that go into protecting it are not the most important things. And like, they ask him, well, like, what if you can't find food? He forages, and kind of like, people donate stuff or whatever, and he's like, well, if I don't find food, then I die just like any other animal out there in the wilderness. Like, I'm not any more special than anything else. Like, I'm part of this story, and I think the will to survive, which is the precursor to the will to power. It's like, that is the thing that we're really hung up on. Like, well, we need to survive. That's the most important thing. But it's like, he's kind of saying, well, that's still another layer of your egoic narcissism. That's saying, like, I'm more important, therefore, and that's why somebody, when Christ says, there's no more love that a man has than he who lays his life down for another. It's like, well, that's basically saying the value structure, which is that the offering of love and compassion as self-sacrifice is the fundamental.
It's a fundamental shift from what is the basic reality of a human being. Is it self, or is it connection?
Self-preservation.
Or is it connection to others? And my fundamental belief, and this might be a leap of faith, but I think it's backed up through science and observation, is that we are actually, that the fundamental human reality is interconnection. It's not isolation. It's not individualism. Right. It's not just my needs versus everyone else's needs. It's at the root, what we need more than anything, what we need more than survival, is connection. Why does the soldier throw themselves on the grenade? Because to him, the connection with his unit is more important than his own life.
Right.
I think that's fundamental to human beings and our identity, is that at the end of the day, we are created for connection with each other, not just for our own survival or to meet our own needs. And so I have hope because of that. I think that the Maoist kind of dehumanizing of others that leads to death and destruction, that's not intrinsic to human nature. That what's actually intrinsic is to see the other and see them as part of us.
Right.
And when we get away from that, that's when bad things happen. But that's actually fundamental, and a return to our nature when we call people to care about others as much as we care about ourselves.
And then expanding the circle of empathy so that it goes well beyond just the human. And
this is the beautiful thing about the New Testament, is that's the narrative that you see laid out in the Jesus story and the story of the early church, is these expanding circles of inclusion. And so Jesus comes and he preaches primarily to Israel, to Jewish people, and yet he preaches to the lepers, the outcasts, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, all the people that had been pushed to the fringes of society and excluded and said, you're not worthy to be part of our community. Those are the people he's wanting to draw the circle around and say, no, you're inside the circle too. And then you see in the book of Acts and the kind of the early church, they say, all right, it's not actually even just the Jewish community. It's actually like, it's Gentiles too. That the circle of inclusion goes even further than just than just our people group.
Yeah.
And this is the whole narrative that you see unfolding is this expanding circles of inclusion, that we're actually all part of the same family. We're all children of God,
right?
And part of the family of God. And so there's this adoption language that runs throughout, the books, especially in Paul's letters, that it's this, the story that the thing that Jesus came to tell us is that God has actually adopted everyone into his family, not just one people group.
Yeah.
And so we're all brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key. I think that's how we get there from here, is to start to see not us versus them, but all of us together, and some of us for all of us. That I feel like the reason I still call myself as a Christian is because that the call of Christ is to choose to freely give of yourself for the good of others. That's not something you can demand or expect of other people.
Yeah.
Especially if you've been in a group that's suffered or been persecuted or oppressed. There's a need to take care of yourself. But if you have the ability to be able to give of yourself, some of us for all of us, for the good of all.
Right.
It's a calling. It's a mission. It's something that you can invite people into. I don't like the term evangelism,
right?
Because I grew up when that was a really,
televangelism.
Right. It's a dirty word in our society. But at its core, it just means to spread the good news.
Yeah.
And for me, the good news is we're all invited into this work of blessing and serving and helping others around us.
Right.
And if you're willing, come and join us in this work.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the question I think that people need to ask themselves, and I think it's been a really helpful question for me, is what is lacking? Like if you consistently feel like things are lacking, then you're constantly going to be craving the fulfillment of the thing. And it's like, so to ask yourself, like, what would it look like? What would it feel like to actually feel as full and connected to whatever your concept of God is, in that you are fully embodied by, let's say, in this scenario.
Yeah.
Like when you feel like, if you say, it's like Nisargadatta, if you've read his book, I Am That. Great book. I think you get a lot from it, but it's classic. But it's like, if you feel like you are that, like, it's kind of like in that language, the only thing that you can definitely assert is that I am. Anything beyond that is subjective.
Right.
I am fat, I am smart, I am strong, I am whatever. Like, these are all just easily arguable from some other perspective, some other point of view. But to say that if we're having this conversation, it's very easy for us to both agree, I am, you are. That's a foundational place to operate from. Yep. So it's like, and then if you say I am, and you sort of associate yourself with like the God consciousness or Christ consciousness or Buddha nature or any of these kinds of things, what that infuses in you, if you can actually allow that, is a sense of fullness that then allows for all of those other things that I think we've been hammering away on in this conversation, which is that sense of compassion, where I'm not being compassionate because my ego is saying, oh, I'm in such a great place and I'm just going to be, it's not that weird. Like it's a byproduct. It's the natural outpouring of an awareness, of an embodied awareness that just comes out naturally. There's no force or coercion. It's kind of like, the term spiritual bypassing, which is very common in personal development and kind of spiritual growth. It's like spiritual bypassing is to pretend she said a bunch of bad stuff about me, but it doesn't really bother me,
sort of passive aggressive.
I'm totally spiritual, man. Like, my God nature is not touched by that kind of stuff, but it's like inside you're actually seething and you will make them pay. But it's like, but it's that when you actually do embody the thing, that consciousness, the natural byproduct of it is compassion. It is because there's nothing in you that is lacking. There's nothing in that moment. There's nothing that you are striving for. Your isness is so full. It is the alpha and the omega. So what the hell else do you need?
I would love to get to that place.
Yeah, wouldn't we all? But you can. I think if you've had moments of that, at least it gives you an awareness of like, and people feel it. I mean, this is that glow that, you know, Christians want to always wish they had. You know, it's like, I'm just so full of God that people just are naturally gravitating towards the cross, baby. Yeah. You know, it's like, well, yeah, not so much. But when you and you occasionally meet these people, you know, if you're on the journey and you're, you know, I find that more when I'm sort of out in the world and like on the road and kind of just in this more flow kind of state instead of kind of what I consider the matrix, which is sort of where we're at. But you meet these sort of characters in these unusual places, and it's like they're not preaching anything, they're not doing anything for whatever reason. Like they got the spark of God, whatever that is, and it's just so free. It's so free and so untethered and untainted. It's not to say that they may not, in another context, may be an entirely different person, but in that moment, they are God as much as anything else is God.
Was it St. Francis said, preach the gospel always, if necessary, use words. I think his idea was, you know, just live it, embody it.
Yeah.
Embody that God consciousness.
Father Thomas Keating, and I love that, in silence God speaks.
Yes.
Perfect. And on that note, tell people where they can find your work and what you're up to.
They can go to spiritualtransformationproject.com. And that will, right now it'll take you to my Facebook page because I'm still working on the website.
Okay.
But if you sign up for the email list, click the little sign up button on the Facebook page, that'll get you on the email list. Great. You'll get all the updates about upcoming events and the festival next fall, and you'll just stay in the loop that way. That's probably the best way to just find out what's happening here in Austin, in Central Texas. You know, in the festival, we're hoping is going to have a national draw, so people, you know, wherever you're listening from, can come in and join us for that weekend.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, Mike.
Thanks, John. I really
appreciate having you.
Yeah.
So there you go. Another stimulating conversation with another stimulating guest. Mike Clawson, Spiritual Transformation Project. Look him up. Got some good stuff going on for the community. He's also doing the festival that I talked about next year, so check that out. That is called, let me get my notes here, the New Story Festival. So that'll take place next fall in 2018. If you're enjoying this podcast, head over to thewisdomdistillery.net and click on the Patreon page. You can also check out some of my music at shamanjohnmusic.com. That's SHAMANJON music.com. If you like the jams you heard on this episode, we're working with the lovely sounds of Otis McDonald. Just type in Otis McDonald and you'll find his jams. He's a Bay Area guy, and his name is not Otis, as it turns out. It's Joe. So, Otis, Joe, go figure. It's great music, one way or the other. Guy can jam, and the guy can write. So thanks again for listening, taking the time out of your day, letting us keep you company, doing whatever it is that you're doing. Hope this stimulated some interesting questions in your own mind, some curiosity. Stay curious, people. Stay open-hearted. And when the world seems crazy outside, look inward. We'll catch you on the next go-round. Peace. They don't say things the same. To work like two out the door. Then you have